There is a person in this world who has been told they are too sensitive, too emotional, too affected by everything. That person learned very early that love required attunement. They scanned faces, tones, subtle shifts in energy. They became experts in other people's pain while quietly abandoning their own. What we often call empathy is not simply kindness. It is, in many cases, an adaptation. A brilliant one. A child discovers that safety depends on reading the room, on anticipating anger, on soothing distress, on becoming what others need. And so the nervous system wires itself for hyper-awareness. But here's the truth. What was once survival is not destiny. The empath's exhaustion is not weakness. It is a signal. The body is saying, I cannot keep betraying myself to belong. For years, empathy flowed outward, while resentment, fatigue, and confusion accumulated inward. And many empaths began to believe something was wrong with them because they felt depleted by the very gift they were praised for. Nothing is wrong with them. The comeback begins the moment the empath understands that compassion without boundaries is self-abandonment. When empathy is not balanced with self-regard, it becomes a trauma response. It becomes a way to earn love rather than receive it freely. And the nervous system cannot heal while it is constantly on guard. The biggest comeback of the empath's life is not about becoming harder. It is not about shutting down the heart. It is not about becoming cold or indifferent. It is about integration. It is about turning the same attunement inward. Imagine what happens when the empath begins to notice their own tightening chest, their own fatigue, their own anger, without shame, without judgment, just curiosity, because curiosity is the doorway to healing. When the empath says no for the first time without over-explaining, something profound shifts. The body trembles, guilt may arise, fear of abandonment may whisper old stories. But if they stay present, they discover something extraordinary. The world does not collapse. In fact, something else collapses, the illusion that love must be earned through self-sacrifice. The empath's power was never in overgiving. It was in their capacity for connection, and connection must include the self. For years, they felt responsible for regulating other people's emotions. They felt anxious when others were upset. They felt compelled to fix, soothe, rescue. But that responsibility was never truly theirs. It was assumed in childhood when emotional survival depended on it. Now as adults, they are allowed to put that burden down. This is the comeback. The comeback is nervous system regulation that does not depend on pleasing others. It is relationships chosen from authenticity rather than fear. It is compassion that includes clear limits. It is understanding that saying I matter too is not selfish. It is sanity. And something remarkable happens when empaths reclaim themselves. Their empathy becomes cleaner, freer. It is no longer entangled with desperation or hidden expectation. It becomes a conscious offering rather than a compulsion. They begin to attract different relationships, not because they changed who they are, but because they stopped abandoning themselves. The greatest transformation is this. The empath no longer confuses intensity with intimacy. They no longer interpret chaos as chemistry. They recognize safety as the new attraction. And safety feels unfamiliar at first, but unfamiliar does not mean wrong. It means new. The empath's comeback is quiet but powerful. It is not loud revenge. It is not dramatic withdrawal. It is the steady rebuilding of self-trust. Every time they listen to their own needs, every time they honor their exhaustion, every time they choose truth over approval, neural pathways shift, the body relaxes, the heart opens not to everyone but to what is aligned. Sensitivity was never the problem. Disconnection from the self was. And when sensitivity is paired with boundaries, self-awareness, and compassion directed inward, it becomes wisdom. The empath is not here to disappear for others. They are here to live fully, connected and grounded. This is not the end of their empathy. It is the beginning of conscious empathy. And that is the biggest comeback of their life. Sensitivity is often misunderstood in a culture that rewards detachment, dominance, and emotional control. The empath grows up hearing that they are too soft, too emotional, too reactive. Over time, they may internalize the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with them. Yet what appears as fragility is often a highly intelligent survival strategy shaped by early experience. Sensitivity did not arise by accident. It developed in response to an environment where attunement was necessary for safety, belonging, or love. In many cases, the empath was a child who learned to read the room before they learned to read books. They noticed subtle shifts in facial expressions, tone of voice, posture, and silence. They sensed tension before it erupted. They felt the emotional weather patterns of the household and adjusted themselves accordingly. This was not weakness. It was the nervous system doing exactly what it is designed to do: protect the organism from threat and increase the chances of connection. When a child grows up in an unpredictable or emotionally complex environment, Hyper-awareness becomes protective. If a parent is overwhelmed, depressed, angry, or inconsistent, the child may unconsciously decide that their role is to stabilize the atmosphere. They become the peacemaker, the helper, the invisible one who does not add to the burden. Their sensitivity sharpens because it must. Their brain wires itself to detect danger and disconnection quickly. This wiring is adaptive in childhood. It increases survival. It maintains attachment. Attachment is not a luxury for a child, it is a biological necessity. The young nervous system prioritizes connection over authenticity because connection equals survival. If being fully expressive risks rejection or punishment, the child learns to suppress certain emotions. They may disconnect from anger, from sadness, even from joy if it draws negative attention. Instead, they tune into others. They study what pleases, what calms, what avoids conflict. Sensitivity becomes their compass. Over time, this adaptation becomes identity. The empath is praised for being caring, thoughtful, mature beyond their years. Adults may admire their empathy without recognizing the cost. What looks like compassion may carry an undercurrent of vigilance. What appears as generosity may be fueled by fear of abandonment. The empath is not consciously manipulating, they are responding to a deep nervous system imprint that says, if I stay attuned to others, I will be safe. The tragedy is not the sensitivity itself. The tragedy is the self-abandonment that often accompanies it. Because attention is directed outward, the empath may lose access to their own internal signals. Hunger, fatigue, anger, overwhelm. These cues are muted in favor of maintaining harmony. The body continues to register stress, but the mind prioritizes others' needs. This disconnection from the self can later manifest as anxiety, burnout, resentment, or confusion about personal boundaries. Yet even here, it is important to see the brilliance of the adaptation. The nervous system chose the strategy that maximized connection in a given environment. It did not choose weakness. It chose survival. It chose belonging. The empath's capacity to feel deeply is evidence of a system that remained open rather than shutting down completely. Many people cope with stress by numbing, dissociating, or hardening. The empath coped by opening, by tuning in, by caring more. That openness is not a flaw. It is a strength that developed under pressure. As adults, however, adaptations that once ensured safety may no longer serve growth. Hyper-attunement can become hypervigilance. Compassion can become compulsion. Sensitivity can turn into overwhelm in a world filled with constant stimuli and emotional demands. The empath may find themselves in relationships where they overgive, overextend, and overfunction. They may feel responsible for fixing others, pain while neglecting their own. The turning point comes when sensitivity is reframed. Instead of asking, why am I so weak? The empath begins to ask, what did my sensitivity help me survive? This shift changes everything. It removes shame and introduces understanding. When shame dissolves, curiosity becomes possible. With curiosity, healing begins. Healing does not require the empath to become less sensitive. It requires integration. It requires learning that safety no longer depends on constant vigilance. It involves teaching the nervous system that boundaries do not equal abandonment. It means practicing awareness of one's own internal states with the same attentiveness once reserved only for others. As the empath reconnects with their own emotions, something stabilizing occurs. Anger becomes information rather than threat. Sadness becomes a signal rather than weakness. Fatigue becomes guidance rather than failure. Sensitivity, once directed exclusively outward, becomes balanced with inward attunement. This is where adaptation transforms into empowerment. The very trait that developed in response to stress becomes a profound asset when paired with self-awareness. Sensitivity allows for deep connection, creativity, intuition, and authenticity. It fosters meaningful relationships rooted in mutual respect rather than one-sided caretaking. It enables leadership grounded in compassion rather than control. The empath's journey is not about hardening the heart. It is about strengthening the spine while keeping the heart open. It is about understanding that the same nervous system that once scanned for danger can now scan for truth. It is about recognizing that adaptation was intelligent, even if it was costly. When sensitivity is no longer entangled with fear, it becomes wisdom. When empathy includes the self, it becomes sustainable. The empath does not need to erase the adaptation. They need to update it. They need to honor the child who learned to survive through attunement while gently teaching the adult body that safety can now include authenticity. Sensitivity was never weakness. It was the nervous system's creative response to circumstance. And when met with understanding rather than judgment, it reveals itself not as a liability, but as a profound and resilient form of strength. Hyper-awareness is often born in environments where unpredictability was the norm. When a child grows up in a space where moods shift suddenly, where anger erupts without warning, or where emotional presence is inconsistent, the nervous system adapts quickly. It learns to scan, to anticipate, to detect the smallest cues that signal danger or disconnection. This scanning becomes automatic. It is not a conscious decision. It is the body's way of staying safe. The brain under stress prioritizes survival over relaxation. Neural pathways strengthen around vigilance. The amygdala becomes more reactive. Stress hormones move through the bloodstream more frequently. The body prepares for fight, flight, freeze, or fawn long before the conscious mind understands what is happening. Over time, this state of alertness feels normal. Calm can even feel unfamiliar or unsafe. In childhood, hyper-awareness serves a purpose. It helps predict conflict. It minimizes harm. It maintains attachment by allowing the child to adjust behavior quickly. But what protects in one season of life can imprison in another. As the child grows into adulthood, the same heightened sensitivity to tone, posture, silence, and subtle shifts may lead to anxiety, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. The nervous system continues to respond as though threat is imminent, even in relatively safe environments. Hyper-awareness often manifests as reading too much into small changes. A delayed text message feels like rejection. A neutral facial expression feels like anger. A minor disagreement feels like impending abandonment. The body reacts first, the mind scrambles to explain. The heart rate increases. Muscles tense. Thoughts spiral. The individual may not even realize that their reaction is rooted in old experiences rather than present reality. Yet within this pattern lies immense potential. The same awareness that once detected danger can detect truth. The same sensitivity that anticipated harm can anticipate misalignment. Trauma may have shaped the nervous system to be alert, but awareness itself is not the enemy. It is the interpretation, an automatic reaction that creates suffering. When awareness is unconscious, it controls behavior. When awareness becomes conscious, it becomes choice. This shift marks the beginning of transformation. Instead of being swept away by every internal alarm, the individual begins to observe it. They notice the tightening in the chest. They notice the racing thoughts. They recognize the impulse to fix, to flee, or to appease. Observation creates space. In that space, power emerges. Power in this context is not dominance over others. It is regulation within the self. It is the capacity to pause between trigger and response. Trauma compresses that pause. Healing expands it. The more one practices noticing internal states without immediate reaction, the more the nervous system learns that awareness does not have to equal emergency. Mindfulness becomes a practical tool rather than a spiritual abstraction. Bringing attention to breath slows the stress response. Naming emotions reduces their intensity by engaging higher cortical functions. Orienting to the present environment reminds the body that the current moment is different from the past. These practices retrain neural pathways over time. The amygdala becomes less reactive. The prefrontal cortex strengthens its regulatory role. Awareness also brings discernment. Hyper-aware individuals often possess deep intuition. They can sense incongruence between words and actions. They notice patterns others overlook. Without healing, this intuition may be clouded by fear, leading to suspicion or self-doubt. With healing, it becomes clarity. Instead of assuming the worst, the individual can gather information, verify perceptions, and respond grounded in evidence rather than projection. Another dimension of power lies in boundaries. Trauma-conditioned hyper-awareness often focuses outward, monitoring others' needs and moods. When awareness turns inward, it begins to monitor personal limits. Fatigue becomes noticeable earlier. Resentment is recognized as a signal rather than suppressed. Discomfort is acknowledged rather than rationalized. This inward attention allows for timely boundary setting, which prevents burnout and deepens authentic connection. Relationships transform when awareness is paired with self-trust. Rather than reacting defensively to perceived slights, the individual can communicate openly. Rather than withdrawing at the first hint of tension, they can assess whether the situation truly threatens safety. Awareness shifts from scanning for catastrophe to evaluating reality. This grounded presence fosters stability both internally and relationally. It is important to recognize that this transformation does not occur overnight. The nervous system changes gradually through repetition and compassionate practice. Setbacks happen. Old triggers resurface. But each moment of conscious observation weakens the automatic grip of trauma. Each regulated breath reinforces a new pattern. There is profound dignity in reclaiming awareness from the grip of fear. What once felt like a burden becomes a refined instrument. The individual who once felt overwhelmed by stimuli may now navigate complex emotional landscapes with steadiness. They can sit with discomfort without collapsing. They can hold space for others without losing themselves. Trauma shaped hyper-awareness as a shield. Healing reshapes it as a compass. The shield was necessary when danger was real and frequent. The compass becomes valuable when navigating a broader world with intention. Awareness guided by fear restricts life. Awareness guided by presence expands it. The journey from hypervigilance to empowered awareness is ultimately about safety. As the body learns that it is no longer trapped in past conditions, vigilance softens. Sensitivity remains, but urgency diminishes. The nervous system discovers that it can be alert without being alarmed. In this integration, awareness becomes power not because it controls the external world, but because it stabilizes the internal one. The individual is no longer driven solely by old survival patterns. They participate consciously in their responses. They move from reaction to reflection, from compulsion to intention. Trauma may have wired the system for hyper-awareness, but healing rewires it for wisdom. The capacity to notice deeply does not disappear, it evolves. And in that evolution, what once felt like a curse reveals itself as a profound source of strength. Self-abandonment is rarely a conscious decision. It begins as a strategy, often formed in early relationships where authenticity threatened connection. A child quickly learns which emotions are welcome and which create distance. If anger leads to withdrawal, the child suppresses anger. If sadness overwhelms a caregiver, the child hides sadness. If joy attracts criticism or envy, joy is dimmed. The child adapts, trimming parts of the self in order to preserve attachment. What looks like compliance is often fear of losing love. Over time, this pattern solidifies. The individual becomes skilled at prioritizing others' needs while ignoring their own internal signals. They say yes when their body says no. They tolerate disrespect to avoid conflict. They override exhaustion to maintain approval. Self-abandonment becomes normalized, even praised as kindness or loyalty. Yet beneath the surface, resentment and emptiness grow. The nervous system registers the cost of chronic self-betrayal. Self-abandonment is not simply neglecting preferences. It is a fracture in the relationship with oneself. It is the moment when internal experience is dismissed in favor of external harmony. Each dismissal sends a subtle message inward. Your feelings are inconvenient, your needs are excessive, your boundaries are selfish. Over years, this internalized narrative becomes automatic. The individual may struggle to identify what they feel because they have spent so long scanning others instead. The body, however, does not forget. It communicates through tension, anxiety, fatigue, digestive issues, headaches. These symptoms are not random malfunctions. They are signals of misalignment. When inner truth is consistently ignored, stress accumulates. The sympathetic nervous system remains activated, preparing for relational threat, even in neutral situations. The immune system may weaken. Sleep may be disrupted. The cost of self-abandonment is both emotional and physiological. Transforming self-abandonment into self-compassion begins with awareness. Noticing the impulse to override oneself is the first step. It may show up as agreeing too quickly, apologizing unnecessarily, minimizing hurt, or feeling guilty for having needs. Instead of criticizing these patterns, self-compassion invites curiosity. What fear is underneath this reaction? What early experience taught that authenticity risks disconnection? Self-compassion is not indulgence. It is the practice of meeting one's internal experience with kindness rather than judgment. It recognizes that self-abandonment once served a protective purpose. It allowed the individual to maintain relationships that felt essential for survival. A compassionate stance honors the history without perpetuating it. Developing self-compassion involves rebuilding trust with the self. This requires slowing down enough to feel. Many who habitually abandon themselves are uncomfortable with their own emotions. Emotions were once dangerous or overwhelming. Learning to sit with sadness, anger, or fear without immediately suppressing them is a profound act of courage. It communicates safety to the nervous system. It signals that internal experiences can be tolerated rather than avoided. Boundaries naturally emerge from self-compassion. When a person values their inner world, they become less willing to sacrifice it for temporary approval. Saying no becomes less about rejecting others and more about protecting integrity. Guilt may still arise, especially if boundaries were discouraged in the past. Self-compassion acknowledges the guilt without surrendering to it. It understands that discomfort does not equal wrongdoing. Another dimension of self-compassion involves language. The internal dialogue of someone prone to self-abandonment is often harsh. Mistakes trigger shame. Imperfections invite self-criticism. Transforming this voice requires intentional practice. Replacing condemnation with understanding softens the nervous system. Instead of saying, "I am too sensitive," the inner voice can say, "My sensitivity developed for a reason." Instead of, "I always ruin things," it can say, "I am learning new patterns." Relationships shift when self-compassion grows. The individual becomes less attracted to dynamics that require self-erasure. They may notice discomfort sooner in unbalanced interactions. They may withdraw from connections rooted in control or manipulation. This shift can feel lonely at first because familiar patterns dissolve before healthier ones solidify. Self-compassion provides stability during this transition. It reassures the individual that solitude is not failure but space for alignment. Practicing self-compassion also involves tending to physical needs. Rest, nourishment, movement, and moments of quiet are not luxuries. They are foundations of regulation. Honoring the body counters years of dismissal. Each act of care reinforces the message that the self matters. Over time, the nervous system internalizes this message, reducing hypervigilance and anxiety. It is important to recognize that self-compassion does not eliminate responsibility. It allows accountability without shame. When mistakes occur, they are addressed with reflection rather than self-attack. This balanced approach fosters growth. Shame paralyzes, compassion mobilizes. By removing the threat of internal punishment, the individual becomes more willing to examine behavior honestly. The transformation from self-abandonment to self-compassion is gradual. Old habits resurface under stress. The urge to please may intensify during conflict. Rather than viewing these moments as regression, self-compassion treats them as reminders of unfinished healing. Each time the individual chooses to honor their feelings instead of dismissing them, new neural pathways strengthen. As self-compassion deepens, identity shifts. The person who once defined themselves through others. Approval begins to experience intrinsic worth. Decisions align more closely with values than with fear. Emotional regulation improves because internal states are acknowledged early rather than suppressed until they erupt. Ultimately, self-compassion restores wholeness. It integrates the parts once hidden for survival. Anger becomes assertiveness. Sadness becomes depth. Sensitivity becomes wisdom. The individual no longer fragments themselves to maintain connection. They bring their full presence into relationships, grounded in the knowledge that belonging does not require self-erasure. Self-abandonment was a strategy born of necessity. Self-compassion is a choice born of awareness. In choosing compassion toward oneself, the cycle of internal neglect begins to dissolve, replaced by a steady, respectful partnership with one's own humanity. For many people, especially those who learned early in life to equate love with self-sacrifice, the word boundary carries a quiet charge of fear. It can feel like withdrawal, like punishment, like abandonment. When someone who has spent years overextending begins to say no, guilt often rises immediately. The body tightens. The mind anticipates conflict. There is an old belief underneath the discomfort. If I limit access to myself, I will lose connection. Yet boundaries are not acts of aggression. They are biological necessities. The nervous system is designed to move between states of engagement and rest. When a person constantly overrides their limits in order to maintain harmony, the body remains in a prolonged stress response. Muscles stay tense. Sleep becomes shallow. Irritability increases. Over time, what began as generosity turns into exhaustion and resentment. The system cannot sustain endless output without protection. A boundary is simply the recognition of a limit. It is the moment the body signals enough. It may show up as fatigue after repeated emotional caretaking. It may appear as anxiety before meeting someone who chronically disrespects time or energy. It may emerge as anger when personal values are dismissed. These sensations are not flaws in character. They are information. They indicate that something in the relational field is exceeding capacity. When boundaries are absent, the nervous system remains vigilant. It monitors for the next demand, the next emotional wave to absorb. Hypervigilance becomes normalized. The individual may believe they are being kind, yet their physiology tells another story. Chronic stress hormones circulate through the bloodstream. Digestive patterns shift. Immune function may weaken. The body carries the weight of unspoken no's. Understanding boundaries as nervous system protection reframes the entire conversation. A no is not a rejection of another person's worth. It is a recognition of one's own capacity. It says, I want to engage from steadiness rather than depletion. It honors the biological truth. The connection requires regulation. Without regulation, Relationships become transactional or strained. For those who grew up in environments where boundaries were ignored or punished, asserting them can feel dangerous. If a caregiver reacted with anger or withdrawal, when the child expressed independence, the child learned that limits threaten attachment. That learning imprints deeply. In adulthood, even minor acts of self-assertion may activate old survival fears. The racing heart during a simple boundary-setting conversation is not weakness. It is memory stored in the nervous system. Healing involves gently teaching the body that boundaries do not automatically equal abandonment. This teaching happens through experience. When a person sets a small, respectful limit and survives the discomfort that follows, new neural pathways begin to form. The brain gathers evidence the connection can withstand honesty. Each regulated interaction weakens the association between boundaries and loss. Boundaries also clarify responsibility. Without them, emotional roles blur. One person may take on the task of regulating everyone else's feelings while neglecting their own. This imbalance breeds quiet resentment. With boundaries, emotional responsibility returns to its rightful owner. Each individual becomes accountable for their reactions, choices, and regulation. This shift creates healthier interdependence rather than enmeshment. It is important to distinguish boundaries from control. A boundary does not attempt to change another person's behavior. It communicates what one will or will not participate in. It might sound like, "I cannot continue this conversation if voices are raised." It might involve leaving a space that feels unsafe. It might mean declining requests that exceed capacity. The focus remains on self-regulation rather than forcing compliance. As boundaries strengthen, the nervous system begins to relax. There is less need for hypervigilance because limits are explicit. The body no longer braces constantly for intrusion. Energy that was once spent anticipating overwhelm becomes available for creativity, presence, and joy. Calm engagement replaces reactive survival patterns. Relationships often transform in response to boundaries. Some connections deepen because clarity fosters trust. Others may fall away if they relied on overextension or compliance. This loss can be painful, yet it reveals an important truth. Relationships that require self-erasure are not sustainable. Boundaries filter out dynamics rooted in imbalance. They create space for reciprocity. Guilt frequently accompanies this transformation. The internalized voice of earlier conditioning may accuse labeling boundaries as selfish. Meeting the guilt with curiosity rather than submission is part of nervous system healing. Guilt does not automatically indicate wrongdoing. It often signals that a new pattern is emerging where an old one once dominated. Practicing boundaries also strengthens self-trust. Each time an individual listens to their internal cues and acts in alignment with them, confidence grows. The body learns that its signals matter. Over time, decisions become clearer because they are grounded in embodied awareness rather than external pressure. Boundaries do not eliminate compassion, they refine it. When engagement occurs within capacity, empathy remains clean and sustainable. There is less hidden resentment, less silent expectation. Giving becomes a choice rather than a compulsion. This authenticity enhances connection rather than diminishing it. The nervous system thrives in environments of predictability and respect. Clear boundaries contribute to both. They define where one person ends and another begins. They prevent emotional flooding. They support co-regulation by ensuring that interactions do not chronically exceed tolerance. Understanding boundaries as protection rather than rejection shifts the emotional tone around them. Instead of fearing that limits push others away, one can see that limits create the conditions for safe closeness. True intimacy requires differentiation. Without it, relationships collapse into fusion or avoidance. In honoring boundaries, a person affirms their right to exist without constant self-sacrifice. They protect their physiological balance. They engage from steadiness instead of survival. What once felt like a threat to love reveals itself as the very structure that allows love to endure. The empathy is often celebrated as the capacity to feel with others, to sense their emotions, to understand their inner world. For many sensitive individuals, this capacity developed early and intensely. They became fluent in other people as moods before they became familiar with their own. They could detect disappointment in a sigh, anger in a glance, sadness in silence. Their attention flowed outward automatically, scanning, soothing, adjusting. Over time, empathy became synonymous with identity, yet when empathy is directed exclusively outward, something essential is neglected. The inner world becomes secondary. Personal needs, desires, and limits are pushed aside to maintain harmony. The individual may pride themselves on being supportive, reliable, and understanding, But beneath that reliability often lies fatigue. The nervous system grows strained from chronic other focus. The body carries unprocessed emotions that were never given space. Turning empathy inward marks a profound shift. It does not require becoming less caring toward others. It required expanding care to include oneself. This expansion can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. For someone accustomed to monitoring others, focusing inward may initially trigger guilt or anxiety. There may be an internalized belief that self-attention is selfish. That belief usually formed in environments where personal needs were minimized or inconvenient. Inward empathy begins with noticing. It is the simple act of asking, what am I feeling right now? Not what should I feel, not what would keep others comfortable, but what is genuinely present in my body. Sensations become signals. Tightness in the chest might indicate fear or sadness. A knot in the stomach might reveal anxiety. Irritation might mask deeper hurt. Instead of dismissing these cues, inward empathy listens. Listening without judgment is crucial. Many who overextend for others are harsh toward themselves. They criticize their own vulnerability. They label their exhaustion as weakness. They invalidate their anger. Inward empathy replaces condemnation with curiosity. It recognizes that every emotion carries information. Anger may signal a crossed boundary. Sadness may reveal loss. Fear may highlight perceived threat. Each feeling deserves acknowledgement rather than suppression. As empathy turns inward, self-trust begins to grow. When a person consistently acknowledges their internal experience, they send a message to their nervous system that their reality matters. This reduces internal conflict. Instead of battling feelings, they integrate them. The stress response softens when emotions are processed rather than denied. The body no longer needs to escalate symptoms to gain attention. Inward empathy also clarifies desire. Many who habitually prioritize others lose touch with what they want. Decisions revolve around external expectations. By tuning inward, preferences gradually surface. What environments feel energizing? Which relationships feel safe? What activities create meaning? These insights may emerge quietly at first, requiring patience and gentle awareness. There is courage in this process. Turning empathy inward may disrupt familiar relational patterns. When someone who always says yes begins to consider their own needs, dynamics shift. Others may react with surprise or resistance. Old fears of rejection can resurface. Inward empathy provides stability during these moments. It reminds the individual that honoring the self is not betrayal. It is alignment. The comeback lies in reclaiming energy that was previously dispersed. When empathy is balanced between self and others, interactions become more sustainable. Giving arises from fullness rather than depletion. Compassion no longer carries hidden resentment. The individual becomes capable of authentic connection because they are not silently abandoning themselves in the process. Inward empathy also fosters emotional regulation. By regularly checking in with internal states, feelings are addressed early rather than allowed to accumulate. A small frustration can be acknowledged before it becomes explosive anger. Mild fatigue can be honored before it turns into burnout. This proactive awareness stabilizes the nervous system and enhances resilience. Another dimension of inward empathy involves self-forgiveness. Many sensitive individuals carry shame about past choices made in the pursuit of belonging. They may regret overgiving, ignoring red flags, or tolerating mistreatment. Inward empathy views these behaviors through a compassionate lens. It recognizes that they were attempts to secure safety or love. This perspective reduces shame and opens space for growth. As self-empathy deepens, boundaries become clearer and easier to maintain. Limits are not imposed from rigidity but from understanding capacity. The individual can say no without excessive explanation because they trust their internal signals. They no longer require external validation to justify self-care. The transformation is subtle yet powerful. Instead of constantly asking how to be more for others, the person asks how to be true to themselves. Instead of absorbing every emotional current in the room, they discern which currents are theirs to hold. This discernment protects energy and fosters clarity. Empathy turned inward does not diminish kindness. It refines it. When a person understands their own pain, they relate to others from grounded compassion rather than compulsion. They can support without rescuing. They can listen without losing themselves. Their presence becomes steady rather than anxious. Over time, identity shifts. The individual no longer defines himself solely as the caretaker, the peacemaker, or the emotional anchor. They become a whole person with needs and boundaries alongside their capacity for care. This wholeness is the essence of the comeback. The energy once spent scanning for approval is redirected toward authenticity. The nervous system experiences relief as internal conflict decreases. Emotional experiences are integrated rather than fragmented. The individual stands in relationships as an equal participant rather than an invisible supporter. When empathy is turned inward, it illuminates the parts that were previously neglected. It nurtures the inner child who learned to prioritize others for survival. It strengthens the adult who can now choose differently. Through this inward gaze, sensitivity transforms from self-sacrifice into self-respect. The comeback unfolds not through dramatic change, but through consistent, compassionate attention to one's own humanity from an early age. Many people learn to measure their worth through the reactions of others. Approval becomes a currency. A smile from a caregiver signals safety. Praise from authority figures signals belonging. Over time, the nervous system links validation with survival. The child adapts by shaping behavior, tone, even personality around what receives affirmation. This adaptation is intelligent. It preserves connection in environments where acceptance feels conditional. Yet when approval becomes the foundation of identity, strength becomes fragile. It depends on external reinforcement. If affirmation is present, confidence rises. If criticism appears, self-doubt floods in. The emotional system swings with the opinions of others. This instability is not a flaw in character. It reflects early conditioning that equated love with compliance. Authenticity requires a different orientation. It asks a person to turn inward before looking outward. It involves noticing what feels true in the body rather than scanning for what will be praised. This shift can be unsettling. When approval has long been the compass, choosing authenticity may trigger anxiety. The body anticipates rejection. The old survival program whispers that standing out or disagreeing risks abandonment. True strength begins in this tension. It is not loud defiance or rigid independence. It is the quiet capacity to remain connected to oneself, even when external validation is uncertain. This form of strength is regulated rather than reactive. It does not collapse under criticism, nor does it inflate under praise. It remains anchored in internal alignment. The nervous system plays a central role in this transformation. When approval is prioritized, the body often stays in a subtle state of vigilance. It monitors tone shifts, facial expressions, and feedback. Small signs of disapproval can activate stress responses. Heart rate increases, muscles tighten, thoughts race towards self-correction. The individual may apologize quickly, adjust opinions, or withdraw to restore harmony. Authenticity interrupts this cycle. It invites awareness of the stress response without immediate compliance. Instead of reflexively reshaping the self, the person pauses. They notice the tightening chest. They acknowledge the fear of rejection. They breathe. This pause expands the space between stimulus and reaction. Over time, the nervous system learns that disagreement does not equal catastrophe. Living authentically does not guarantee universal approval. In fact, it often reduces it. When a person stops performing for acceptance, some relationships shift. Those built on compliance may weaken. This can feel like loss. The mind may question whether authenticity is worth the discomfort. Yet the alternative is chronic self-abandonment. Seeking approval at the cost of integrity fragments the self. Authenticity fosters integration. Thoughts, emotions, and actions align more closely. There is less internal conflict because choices reflect genuine values. This coherence strengthens resilience. Criticism may still sting, but it does not dismantle identity. The individual evaluates feedback without surrendering self-trust. They can consider another perspective without dissolving into shame. Approval-driven living often leads to overextension. The desire to be seen as helpful, competent, or agreeable pushes people beyond their limits. They say yes when they mean no. They tolerate misalignment to avoid disappointing others. Over time, resentment accumulates. The body carries the burden of suppressed truth. Fatigue and irritability signal the cost of inauthenticity. When authenticity becomes the priority, boundaries emerge more naturally. Saying no is no longer an act of rebellion, but an expression of self-respect. The individual recognizes that strength includes protecting capacity. They understand that agreement without alignment erodes trust in the self. Each honest response reinforces internal stability. Authenticity also deepens connection. Relationships grounded in approval are inherently unstable because they rely on performance. When one person shifts roles or expresses disagreement, the bond strains. In contrast, relationships rooted in authenticity allow for differentiation. Each person can hold distinct opinions and emotions without threatening the connection. This mutual respect fosters genuine intimacy rather than surface harmony. There is vulnerability in authenticity. Revealing true thoughts and feelings exposes the possibility of rejection. Yet vulnerability and strength are not opposites. Strength without vulnerability becomes rigidity. Vulnerability without strength becomes fragility. When combined, they create grounded presence. The individual can speak honestly. While remaining regulated, they can withstand discomfort. without abandoning themselves. The process of shifting from approval to authenticity often uncovers grief. There may be sadness for years spent performing. There may be anger toward environments that conditioned self-suppression. Meeting these emotions with compassion is part of strengthening authenticity. Grief validates the cost of inauthentic living. It clears space for new patterns rooted in truth. Cultural narratives sometimes confuse strength with dominance over emotional suppression. Yet suppression requires constant effort. It consumes energy to maintain a facade. Authenticity, though initially challenging, ultimately conserves energy. There's relief in no longer curating every word for acceptance. The nervous system relaxes when pretense diminishes. Self-worth, grounded in authenticity, is stable because it does not fluctuate with applause or criticism. It arises from congruence between inner values and outer behavior. This stability enhances decision-making. Choices are guided by clarity rather than fear of disapproval. Mistakes become opportunities for learning rather than evidence of unworthiness. True strength is quiet. It does not demand recognition. It is evident in the ability to remain present during disagreement, to uphold boundaries without hostility, to accept that not everyone will approve. It trusts that belonging built on truth is more sustainable than belonging built on performance. As authenticity deepens, approval loses its controlling grip. Appreciation can be received with gratitude rather than dependency. Criticism can be evaluated without collapse. The individual stands firmly in their values while remaining open to growth. This grounded posture reflects a nervous system that feels safe enough to be real. Strength rooted in authenticity does not isolate. It connects from a place of wholeness. It invites others to do the same. It replaces fragile validation seeking with resilient self-trust. In that shift, identity solidifies not around how one is perceived, but around who one genuinely is.